Welcome to Power Hour. We're thrilled today to have occupational therapist Lindy Joffe with us today to discuss sensory processing and regulation. Before we begin, I just want to tell you a little bit about our organization. The Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance is the only nonprofit organization whose sole focus is serving the community of children anywhere on the epilepsy surgery journey, from the point of drug resistance through surgery, including the transition to adulthood and beyond. We empower our families with research, support services, and impactful programs before, during, and after surgery. Formerly known as the Brain Recovery Project, we are in the 12th year of serving this community. Power Hour sessions are brought to you by our corporate sponsor, UCB. We are grateful for their support. So today's guest speaker, Lindy Joffe, is an occupational therapist with over 23 years of experience in pediatric occupational therapy work. I met her 12 years ago when she began working with my son, Bennett, who you see in the picture here. Bennett had a hemispherectomy when he was 2 years old. When I met Lindy, he was about 7 years old, and I still really didn't understand all of the impacts of the hemispherectomy surgery on his sensory systems. But via her assessments and direct therapy with him, Lindy was really pivotal in my understanding of how my son's brain and body worked, and how it didn't work well, and best ways to support him. I still have her detailed evaluations literally at my fingertips in a file folder right behind me. So I'm just absolutely thrilled to have her here today because she's just been a lifeline to me over the past 12 years. Any child can have a sensory processing disorder, but there are particular impacts after epilepsy surgery, which Lindy's going to discuss today. So thank you for being here, Lindy.
Hi, everyone. I'm glad you could make it. First, I just wanted to say that when I was thinking about how to approach this webinar, I had to figure out how detailed to get in a description of sensory processing. And what I ultimately decided was that it was most important to get a good foundational understanding of sensory processing, because everybody comes in with a different knowledge base. But sensory ultimately is, it's more abstract than motor or language, and it really extends through all aspects of function. So I decided today to really do a review of the basics so that we could all get that foundation together, and we'll leave ample time at the end for any kinds of questions or specifics. So very quickly, most of us learn in school that the 5 special senses are vision, touch, sound, smell, and taste. And taste relates to texture as well as temperature. And then the body senses, of course, are the proprioceptive and vestibular senses. And we don't learn about those, but we'll talk briefly about all these senses, because while we probably have a basic understanding of what these senses are, there's ways in which I think our understanding of these senses is different than what we hear about or learn about in school. So the proprioceptive sense is our unconscious awareness of our position of the different muscles, joints, and ligaments in our body. When I think about the proprioceptive system, I really like to think about ourselves, not our kids, not somebody else. I really like to think about our own experience of what it feels like to not have our proprioceptive system working well. And the best way, I think, to think of that is, like, if you've had Novocaine, if you've gone to the dentist, what does it feel like when you can't really talk afterwards and you're kind of like, I'm trying to form my words, but it doesn't really work very well. That's because your proprioceptive system is not really working very well in those moments. So we can't really move well if we can't feel our joints very well. Or similarly, if you've fallen asleep in the middle of the night, what is it, and your arm has fallen asleep, what does it feel like if you can't really move your arm? You wake up in the middle of the night and you're trying to move your arm, but you can't really feel it. And so you don't have good control. So that proprioceptive system really determines the efficiency, the fluidity, the strength, and the coordination of our movements. The vestibular system, people really think of it as balance, but it's not just balance. It really answers 2 basic questions. It tells us which way is up and where am I going. So balance itself is, if we go back to that idea of giving us motor input, is very much affected by proprioception as well. It's affected by some other systems in addition to vestibular and proprioceptive. But our vestibular system is, it responds to gravity, so tells us up, down, and every time we're moving our heads, every time we're doing anything in relation to our heads, we are understanding which way we are moving, which way we are going. And in doing so, it's really giving us righting and equilibrium reactions, which are kind of complicated ways of saying, if I move, if I shift my body, my head kind of stays upright and understands, you know, kind of where I need to kind of right and organize my body. Or equilibrium reactions are my basic balance reactions. We have kids who fall out of chairs a lot because they don't understand that if they shift their body weight, they have to reorganize that body weight to stay upright. So it's postural control, it's head control, and it also tells us our centers. And in doing so, it impacts the balance, our coordination, our sense of the two sides of our body working together, as well as all of our motor skills. Now, one of the things that I think is very interesting in relation to the vestibular system is that there's actually new research that points to an area between the two hemispheres. This is called, you don't have to remember this name, but I like these. I like knowing these names. I like having heard them before, called the anterior precuneus. It's a little sausage-shaped area right between the two hemispheres that's responsible for our sense of embodiment, our physical sense of self, not our understanding, our kind of verbal sense of self, but our physical sense of self. And this area is what processes vestibular signals. So oftentimes when I'm talking about these things, I talk about what we know, and then I will also say, okay, well, this is a theory. So we know that there's research that signals, you know, that there's this part of the body coming from the vestibular system that gives us our physical sense of self. I'm going to theorize now that if we are getting inconsistent or even asymmetrical information from this system, for example, if a child has a hemispherectomy or a corpus calostomy, then that child's going to have more difficulty establishing this physical sense of self. Where am I? And the result of that is a feeling of floating in space. The tactile system, on one hand, seems like an easier system. It is our skin, it's our sense of touch. But what is interesting to me about the tactile system, well, there's many things that are interesting to me about the tactile system, but it really tells us, where are my edges? Where do I end and where does the world begin? And that's a really kind of big thing if we take a step back and think about it, because it defines our spatial sense, our body mapping. Where is my body space in relation to the world? And if I have difficulty kind of understanding where's my body space, then it becomes difficult to understand what is the area right around me, and then also what is the area further away from me. Similarly, if I have difficulty understanding and developing my own sense of my body, then it becomes difficult to do things to learn, like learning how to grasp, or even learning how to hold a pencil, or learning how to hold a fork or a spoon, because all of that is mapped in the brain as, how do I kind of understand my body in relation to something else? Where are my edges? If I'm going to hold a spoon, I need to know where my edge is and where that spoon begins. So we think of that as fine motor, but it's also very much of a tactile, physical, sensory kind of thing. The tactile system also is responsible for protection. It protects our body, and protection in the sense of pain, and also how do I discriminate things. And gives us, of course, pressure, pain and temperature, and body mapping, like I said. The auditory system, also very, very complicated system, and I will do this as briefly as I can because we have a lot to cover. But we tend to think of the auditory system as communication, and of course it is huge for communication. But if we take a step back, sound is vibration. And there's lots of different kinds of sounds in the world, and those sounds give us different things. So low frequency sounds, like the kind of sound that you hear if you are driving in a car and another car pulls up next to you and it's playing a heavy bass, that's a very different sensation, and it's a very different feeling on your body versus a high frequency sound, which carries a lot of detail information. So that low frequency sound you feel on your body, and that can be it's a very vibratory feeling, and that can be good sometimes, but it can also be kind of an intense and scary feeling for a lot of people. The other thing that I want to say about sound right now is that there's a very big difference between hearing versus listening. So I have a story. This is a story from my brother. When he was 4, my parents actually took him to have his hearing tested because he wouldn't respond to them when they would talk to him, enough that it worried them. And he actually went up to the doctor and he said, "I don't have a hearing problem, I have a listening problem." And I think that articulates the difference between the fact that we hear everything, but we only respond to what we're listening to. And there's a lot of children that their hearing is absolutely fine. But for many of us in this world, because our ears didn't develop for the sensory environment that we're in now, that what we listen to and how we listen and what we orient to the world is very different than what we're actually hearing. So what does the auditory system do in addition to our communication? First of all, the auditory system is always on. For example, when we're sleeping and we hear a sound, our child cries out. It's the auditory system that signals that to us. So it's the primary system in environmental monitoring. And that is essential to our sense of safety in the world. It's the one that allows for advanced preparedness. It tells us if we need to attend to something, if we need to go to something. It tells us if something is coming towards us and we need to kind of monitor that and turn towards it. If there's something we need to look at, it's the auditory system that gives us that information. It also generally will give us our three-dimensional spatial surround. So the visual system kind of fills in the details, but it's the auditory system that gives us that three-dimensional sense of space. And then the visual system is the most cognitive of the sensory systems. It works, as I was saying, with the auditory system for our sense of kind of defined and specific set spatial perception, and it refines and enhances information refines and enhances information from the other sensory systems. Also an essential system for safety, but it really does fill in all those details. One important thing about the visual system is that when the other more subconscious systems are not working well, people tend to use the visual system to fill in those gaps. And so very often we see kids who are really, really using their eyes to learn. And that is a signal that, that some of the other more environmental monitoring systems, for example, like the auditory systems, are not giving them the information they need. When that happens, it can be very exhausting for those kids. I'm just very briefly going to go over oral, sensory, motor, and olfactory. Basically, we're looking at taste, temperature, and texture. There are tactile and proprioceptive components to the mouth because the tongue is a very tactile instrument, if you will. And like I was saying with the dentist, it has strong proprioceptive features as well. So we can't separate these things out. The other thing about the tongue is it acts as an internal level for us. So if there are bilateral issues, for example, as in the case with the hemispherectomy, we can have some difficulty kind of understanding our midline, in part because our tongue is not kind of giving us that leveling. And then the olfactory system can affect, it affects our taste, our oral sensory system. It also is the only sensory system that sends messages directly to our emotional brain. In doing so, it influences emotions and memory, which is why if we smell something, we can get a flood of emotion. Now, if we look at how all these systems together integrate, there's a great quote by Jean Ayres, who was a person who created the theory of sensory integration. Sensory integration is the organization of sensations for use. She said, when sensations flow in an organized and well-integrated manner, the brain can use those sensations to form perceptions, behaviors, and learning. And when the flow of sensations is disorganized, life can be like a rush hour traffic jam. And I think that this is really a very key component, this idea of a rush hour traffic jam. So thinking about that, how all these systems work together, there's a tripod analogy that I like to use when thinking about this. If we take a tripod, much like you have with a camera, you need a stable base, and then you need the little connectors that connect the base to the camera, and then you need the camera. And all of those pieces are really important if you want to have a good picture of the world. And the same thing is true for our sensory systems and our body and how it all works together. If any of those parts are not working well together, then there's that traffic jam. So the way that it breaks down in this tripod analogy is that essentially we have our body schema, and the body schema is made up of that vestibular system, and this is just a kind of picture of this. So the body schema is down here, and that's what grounds us. So the vestibular system, the proprioceptive, the tactile system, that all gives us our sense of our body in space. If you take, the map of the mall and the "you are here" arrow, the body schema is the "you are here" arrow in that kind of system. The environmental schema is made up of all of the kind of the sensory systems that reach out into our environment to give us information about what is happening in our world. So that's the map of the mall. And predominantly in those, there's of course the auditory system and the visual system, which are huge in giving us what's happening in our world. There's the vestibular system, because again, vestibular system is giving us information about gravity. And so it is kind of a linking system between our body and our environment. And of course, the olfactory system is also giving us some information about what's happening in our world. And between the body and the environmental schema is that little point, those connectors. And for people, that happens in the neck, because of course, everything that's happening, all of our sensory systems that are giving us information about the world are happening up in the head. There are eyes, there are ears, there are nose, and the vestibular system is little receptors in our inner ears as well. So everything's happening up in the head. So if our neck is not stable, then we're not able to get a good stable picture of the world as well. So all of those systems need to work together to give us both the "you are here" arrow and the map of the mall. Now, there are different types of sensory processing disorders. Under an over responsivity, hyper and hyposensitivity, other names for them, are probably the most well-known. Sensory discrimination disorder and sensory-based motor disorders are also understood and familiar concepts, but they're more often thought of as motor-based disorders than they are sensory-based disorders, and they are motor disorders. But one of the key points that I want to bring home as I talk about this is that we really can't divorce the sensory component from the motor component, because they're really two sides of the same coin. As we are trying to output information, we can only output information when we cleanly and in a coordinated fashion when we have good information coming in. And so we'll get into that a little bit as we get into the section. And I know I'm going through this fast. I just want to cover a lot of information and make sure we have time for questions. So sensory over and under responsivity, or hyperreactivity and hyporeactivity. Hyperreactivity is when any kind of input is perceived as more intense or stimulating than it is. And in this situation, the child is generally just spending more time in a fight, flight, fright response than would typically be seen. On the other hand, hyporeactivity, the child is spending less time, or sensory input is perceived as less intense or stimulating than it is. So the child doesn't respond as much to the input as one would expect. And in that situation, the child may appear lethargic. We're going to talk a little bit more about these states in a little bit. So I'm going to come back to that to explain it a little bit more in a different situation. But one thing I want to say about the hyperreactivity, and this is really important, is that what happens when a child is hyperreactive or an individual is hyperreactive is that we get an increase in a defensive response over time. And the graph looks like this. In a typical sensory system, what will happen is that, for example, if we hear a fire engine, if our auditory system is functioning in a typical way, we hear a fire engine, and we might startle to that. But then our system will come back down to baseline. And then we go along. And then if we have another, say somebody cries out or dog barks, and then our system peaks again, and then it comes back down to baseline. But we have kind of peaks and valleys and peaks and valleys and peaks and valleys, but it stays kind of like that. You can also think about if there's a continuous stimulus, like say you go into a room and there's a noxious smell. You might smell it, but then over time, as you realize it's not dangerous, your system kind of accommodates to it, and it becomes less invasive over time. What happens when you have a defensive system is the opposite. So instead of it becoming less problematic or having this kind of recovery period that goes back to baseline, everything becomes more problematic, and your system you don't ever have that full recovery. And therefore, over time, your system continues to activate until you either go into a defensive kind of fight-flight reaction, or in the most extreme case, a freeze reaction. And that's what's shown in this chart. And when we're looking at kids who are really struggling, for example, at school, and having, whether it's aggressive reactions or shutdown reactions, I think we really have to look at what is happening in terms of the pattern of stimulus response, and whether they're following this kind of a chart, whether they just can't tolerate all of the sensory input that's coming in, and it's just too much for them. Now, sensory discrimination disorder, again, is a kind of disorder that looks like it might be a motor disorder, or on the next slide, I'll talk about what happens with the environmental senses. This is the body senses on this slide. But again, it has this sensory component to it because it's difficulty taking in the sensory information that then turns into difficulty outputting whatever the kind of purposeful behavior is. So some examples of what a sensory discrimination disorder might look like. For the body senses, proprioceptive, vestibular, tactile, proprioceptive might look like difficulty grading force. And by grading force, it's like, you go to shut a door and you shut it too hard, or you're going to write and you're using too little or too much pressure. So it's the use of too little or too much pressure when you're doing something because you can't feel it well. Or a balance challenge for a vestibular system. I liken a vestibular balance challenge to be, when you get on an escalator and it's not moving and you have that kind of period of disorientation before you recover, is a little bit like a child who isn't quite able to sense the vestibular input that's coming in quite the right way, and therefore isn't responding quite the correct way to the vestibular input. I've seen kids who are constantly in motion, and it has to do with an inability to kind of feel the vestibular information. It's almost like somebody who's had too much to drink needs to keep moving, because if they stop, they start spinning. So that's kind of a vestibular sensory discrimination problem. Or knowing an object by feel. We can't feel very well. We can't discriminate what we're feeling, and therefore we can't use it well. So all of this impacts our coordination and our control. And similarly, with the environmental senses, if we're mishearing, because we don't discriminate auditory information well, that can lead to a number of different things. There's a central auditory processing disorder that can come from that. We're not going to get into that, because that we could spend hours, people could spend hours on, and that's a huge subject. But that also has a lot of, if we go back to this issue of safety, which is really big as a part of auditory discrimination, if we can't tell where sounds are coming from, then that's going to really cause a lot of anxiety, because there's going to be a constant, what is happening around me and where is it coming from? And am I safe in this environmental system that I'm working in? If we go back to this idea of vibratory sound and low frequency vibrations carry a lot of power. And if we feel them in our body and we can't find where they're coming from, then that's going to be very, very scary for kids and adults, not just kids, but for individuals, and is going to cause a lot of sensory hypersensitivity, but it's a different kind of sensory hypersensitivity. So there's a number of different components to the auditory system that can come out in terms of auditory discrimination. How do we discriminate auditory information? And what does that look like? And how do we then understand how to treat it? We have to understand it before, of course, we can treat it accurately. And then similarly, visual discrimination. And how do we discriminate visual information? And how then does it impact our understanding of space and shapes and letters and laterality and all of those other components? That's a visual processing issue, but of course it comes from how do we input the information? And all of this can create challenges in terms of disorganization and confusion and inattentiveness. And then from that, behaviors, which are not really behaviors, they're just signs of these kinds of challenges. When we're looking at sensory-based motor disorders, and I think these are, often quite familiar, we're looking at different kinds of postural disorders, a poorly developed underlying awareness of body position, poor core stability, many of those motor challenges that we see with a lot of our kids. And dyspraxia, it's a common term. It stands for difficulty planning and executing novel motor actions. Common term in, amongst us, not common term out in the world. But the thing that I want to say about dyspraxia is that there are different components to dyspraxia. And the four technical components, and I'll explain them briefly, are ideation, planning, execution, and feedback. And there can be challenges in each of these, in any of these areas, in all of these areas. So it can break down in any different kind of way. Ideation is simply the ability to create an idea. I always think of ideation like, I'm not a fantastic drawer. It's never been an easy thing for me. If I look at a white piece of paper and I'm told to draw something, what I draw is a blank. I don't really know what to draw. I don't have great ideation when it comes to drawing. That is ideation. And we have many kids who, if they come into a room, they don't really know what to do in that room. And that is the first step in motor planning, is kind of knowing what to do with a novel activity. And if we don't address this kind of ideational component, then that in and of itself is challenging. Planning is how do we kind of plan it in our heads. Execution is, well, we might be able to kind of come up with the idea and we might be able to have a plan for how to do it, but our bodies don't execute it well. Very common if there's, a CP or something like that. We just can't get our bodies to execute it. And feedback is we might be able to do something, but our brain doesn't get the feedback that it needs to kind of shift the action.
Can I throw in a quick question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think you're going to address this in the coming slides, but it's a great question that just came in, which is, why does my child have different responses depending on where she is? At home, she's easily startled, which sends her running. For example, it's quiet and I say something and she'll jump up and run. At school, they say she doesn't respond to talking or movement in class. I know you're about to talk about kind of sensory regulation, but I'm wondering if this might be an appropriate place to respond to that question.
Sure, absolutely. Yes, I am about to respond to that question, but I'm going to put that in terms of the auditory system and actually, I'm going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to answer it in this context. So there are many multi-sensory integrative functions, and just because of time, I'm not going to talk about all of these different ones. But I just wanted to allude to the fact that these exist, and these are all different parts of how we put sensory information together to do kind of not higher level, because all these things are high level, but more complex functions. So one of these, central peripheral monitoring, is how do we kind of monitor our environmental surround while we're focusing centrally on what's happening here. So, of course, I can't see anybody. I don't know what kind of environment anybody's in right now. My environment right now is very quiet, but oftentimes we're dealing with kind of having to focus on something that is in our foreground, and then there's other stuff going on that's in our background. And if we are able to do our central peripheral monitoring effectively, then what we're doing is we're keeping kind of a background monitor without having too much energy to do it. We're kind of aware of what's happening in our background, but we're paying attention to what's happening in our foreground. And this is really, really an absolutely essential part of sensory processing. And if we can't do this well, one of two things is going to happen. Either we are going to get hyperfocal on what's happening in our foreground, and we're going to completely block out what's happening in the background, or we're not going to be able to focus on what's happening here, and we're going to be in the background making sure that everything is safe. So coming back to this child, I think what is happening at home is that it's a safe environment, and because it's a safe environment, there's no need to kind of be in the background. And so in order to focus, what she's doing is she is hyper-focusing. And in hyper-focusing, the whole background gets blocked out. So there's no awareness of what's going on out there. And then when you come in and address her, the problem is without that environmental monitoring, it's a startle. And we see this with kids, for example, on the playground as well, where without hearing the footsteps of somebody coming towards them, without that kind of spatial monitoring, all of a sudden they will feel like somebody has just attacked them and they will turn around and hit. So it's the same kind of function. And then at school, I suspect that it's what's happening if we go back to that, that visual that I put in of the defensive reaction. I suspect that she's in a shutdown mode. And she's just not responding at all because it's just too overwhelming. So I suspect, again, without seeing her, that there's something going on in her auditory system where she's not able to process all of the input, and she's not able to do this kind of effective central peripheral monitoring, and it's just overwhelming her system. So did I cover it all, Audrey?
I think so, yeah. And I think when we get to the Q&A, we can talk a little bit more. So if you people
Okay.
want to hang on a little bit, we can stay for a few more questions.
Yeah. Okay. So, and this next section should also address that, a little bit more, not as specifically, but a little bit more broadly. But that is a huge, it's good to address that question right now, because that is a huge problem, and it's a really pervasive problem for a lot of people. Really, really common. So sensory regulation refers to the ability to synthesize, organize, and process incoming sensory information received from the body and the environment to produce purposeful, goal-directed activities. And as I said earlier, I really like to think about these things not as what's happening to our children or what's happening out there, but like, how does this stuff work for us? Because we all have had experiences of being dysregulated. Everybody in this world has had experiences of being dysregulated. And if we can think about what it feels like to us to be dysregulated, we can understand better what's happening with our kids. So if we kind of come to this, sensory regulation is a continuum. And most of the time, we're in this middle kind of just right state, ideally, kind of in a perfect world. Most of the time we're in just right state, but we all have these edges where a small percentage of the time we are too high, we are overwhelmed, we are hyperreactive, and a small percentage of the time we're too low, we are underreactive, we're not processing information as quickly, as smoothly as we should. And so I like in these times, I like to use analogies, like that too high state is when you're walking through a dark alley late at night and somebody touches you on the shoulder. And if that was, on your street in the middle of the day and somebody came up and touched you on your shoulder, you would just turn and look. But in that dark alley in the middle of the night, you startle or you hit the person's hand away. It's a scary feeling. And not only is it a scary feeling, but that touch actually feels different. Your body actually registers it as sharp and painful because your system is too reactive. On the other side, the low side, I like to think of that as, you've been on the road for a while, maybe you're in a car trip, and you're the passenger in the car, and whoever's driving says your name. Audrey, I'll use you. Say you and I are on a car trip right now, and I'm driving, and I say, Audrey, Audrey, Audrey. And it takes maybe 3 times. And then Audrey comes up, oh yeah, I realizes she heard it the first time, but she didn't really process it. It took to the 3rd time to realize that, she had been called. And these things happen. They're normal parts of the sensory regulatory continuum, but most of the time we're in just right. And in that just right, the first time somebody calls your name, you hear it and you respond, not hear it, I shouldn't say, you listen to it, you orient to it, and you respond to it. And when somebody touches you on the shoulder, you just turn and look. So within this continuum, there are times that we just kind of go with the too high or go with the too low, but there are also times that we're trying to compensate. So let's go back to the car trip example. Let's say that Audrey is not a passenger now, but she's a driver, and she can't just kind of get lulled by the road. Now she has to bring herself into a just right state. So what does she do? She might, turn up the radio. She might turn down the window if it's cold outside. She might kind of go like that to, get herself awake. She might shake her head. These are all different kinds of sensory seeking behaviors to increase the stimulation that's coming into her system to wake herself up. She might also have a cup of coffee to help wake herself up, or, a soda, something like that. All of these things to bring herself back into just right. So she's trying to increase the stimulation. Similarly, if we're too high, our sensory systems are overwhelmed, what we're going to try to do is bring down the stimulation. So I don't know how many people are old enough to remember a commercial from, this was when I was a child, so it's a long time ago, for Calgon Take Me Away. There was a commercial of a woman who she's trying to cook dinner, and her kids are screaming in the background, and the dog is barking, and there's just all kinds of stuff going on and she's quite overwhelmed. And then I think the doorbell rings. And when the doorbell rings, she screams, Calgon, take me away. And the next thing you see, she's in a quiet bath and there's candlelight. The lights are low and she's got candles burning and there's quiet music playing. So that's trying to bring down the stimulation to bring ourselves back into just right. And so when we're thinking about our kids, what happens is that all these states are the same, but the just right is, instead of being here, perhaps our high line is here, and then we're spending more time in that high space. Maybe the low is the same, or maybe the low is over here and we're spending more time in the low space. There's still a just right, but the lines are different. And so what we need to look at is, okay, well, how do we help the child get into that just right? Because that child still has a just right. What do we need to do? And also understand, well, is the child predominantly kind of coming to the next slide, a walking through a dark alley late at night kid, a tired passenger, a tired driver, or a Calgon take me away? Like, what category is, and there's never just one category. Kids, we all vary. There's no clean lines here. What category is the child kind of falling into most often? And because if we kind of understand this about our child, then we know what kind of supports we can put into place better and more effectively. And this isn't quite as easy as it sounds, because if we look at kind of what are the behaviors that we see in these general profiles, it can get kind of complicated because there's some things that look kind of similar. For example, the increased sensitivity, this is our walking through a dark alley late at night category over here. We can have inattentive and fidgety and disorganized, and our decreased sensitivity over here trying to compensate can look the same. And over here, we need to decrease the amount of input, and over here, we need to increase the amount of input. So we need to think about, well, is this child anxious, or is this child more of kind of a class clown on the go and hyperactive? Some of these, we can't just look at the question of inattentive and disorganized. So it needs to go a little bit deeper into where does this stuff fall. Similarly, withdrawn is over here with decreased sensitivity, and it's also over here with increased sensitivity. So just kind of going a step further to what are the other components? What's causing the withdrawal? What's causing these behaviors, to get underneath it all so that we can provide the right kind of supports to help these kids' sensory systems. And when does this happen? And I think this is where, for me, I always say when I'm talking about the stuff that, if I do something right, then it's treatment. And if I do it wrong, then it's assessment. So there's no huge issue with making a mistake around this, but really understanding what I'm looking for so then I can use the information effectively is key.
Can I interrupt you there as well?
Absolutely.
Sorry, because I think this is relevant. So the question is about a child that's searching for proprioceptive input on the playground in a way the school deems inappropriate, laying face down on the swing. And so I mentioned in the chat that in the Q&A that's a proprioceptive. They're seeking that proprioceptive behavior. And this is based on what I learned from my expert, Lindy Joffe. So correct me if I'm wrong, but seeking that behavior, and that if the school needs to provide an appropriate sensory diet for the child and appropriate sensory outlets for the child in order to help them stay regulated throughout the day. So I think what parents want to hear is, what are the practical things they can ask the school to do to address this? Because I think saying, well, that's not an appropriate behavior on the playground without a replacement behavior. It's not a behavior, by the way. It's like, it's a need that would be like, if you were, I don't know if any of you are in menopause, but this is my favorite example. If I'm having a hot flash and someone said to me, you cannot take off your sweater, leave that sweater on, young lady. Do not take off your sweater. I would throw something across the room because at that moment, I have to take off my sweater, right? So it's not like this child is doing something willfully or to be troublesome, or it's not a behavior. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think this is really important to understand, both for the parents and then also how to communicate that to the child's team.
Right. And yeah, I think this is really, this is really key. I mean, I think, I often will say that I'm just a detective, and behaviors are just clues. They are not and kids don't act out. They're just giving us clues about what's going on with them. So I, first of all, trying to understand this, if a child is face down on the swing, is the child lying with the head down? If that's the case, then that's also seeking vestibular input heavily. And I'm not exactly sure why it's inappropriate for the school. So that's a whole other conversation. But we also need to look then at the vestibular system in addition to the proprioceptive system. I think there's a lot of conversation with the school that needs to happen, just in terms of understanding that child's needs. And if the child is just doing it during recess and not at other times, and there's no issues kind of during the school day, then I'm very confused as to why that's a problem, honestly, because but perhaps I'm misunderstanding something.
So she is the parent saying she is putting her head down. I mean, I think about this, and I know this child had a hemispherectomy as well. I think about it for my own son, and things that you taught me. And I actually just pulled out the last report you wrote on him. Walking into that playground, suddenly you have a lot of noise. Everything's moving. Maybe the temperature is different. It could be hot or cold. At least it's different than it was in the classroom. All of a sudden, this child is now having to deal with all of this sensory input. So it kind of, to me, as a layperson, makes sense. With a little bit, I understand that she would be seeking a way to calm or regulate.
Yeah,
She's
absolutely.
completely dysregulated in that environment, which begs the question, is that even the appropriate environment for her, or does she need like additional support in that environment, or tools or structured activities or noise canceling headphones or whatever it would be?
Right. And the other thing about, beyond just the sensory environment of the playground, is that oftentimes recess is the hardest time, because while we think of it as the most fun, it's the hardest because it's the least structured. And so there's no, you do X, Y, or Z during recess. Kids are just, they're expected, from an ideational perspective, they're expected to figure out their own play, and that can be very, very challenging. So there are a lot of different components to recess. A lot of our kids have the hardest time during recess. They can do what they're told, but they can't do what they're not told, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And again, I'm confused as to why swinging with her head down is a problem. I really don't understand. If the child is just, I had a kid who was once ramming his head into other people as well as the sand. I understood why that was a problem, and we found a situation to solve that problem. But I think that the first step is really to try to understand from the school what is bad about this.
Yeah.
Why is this causing problems for the school if she's just swinging?
Yeah.
I just don't understand. And then from there, and to come in from curiosity, and from there, once we can understand, okay, what is causing problems about this for the school, then we can look at, if it is causing problems, maybe she's getting dysregulated because she's getting too much sensory input. And she's getting dysregulated from that swinging. Well, then we can look at, okay, is there a way that we can, because one of the things that will happen, I don't know, can people see my pointer if I do this?
Yes.
Great. Okay. One of the things that will happen is, for example, if this is a case, it's possible that she's walking through a dark alley late at night kid, and she's trying to regulate herself, but she's just overstimulating herself more. It's possible that she is low arousal and she's trying to get herself back into just right, but she's doing too much and she's throwing herself into high arousal. And that's the problem. It's hard to create without understanding exactly what is going on and what the challenge is. It's hard to throw out like this is a possible solution to it, because we just don't know, and there's so many different factors that can impact that. So I think having a real conversation with the school about what does this look like and why is it a problem is the first real step, and from there, we can start to identify what potential solutions are. And the potential solution could just be educating the school.
Yeah. So we only have a few minutes left, Lindy. So I'd love for you to finish your presentation.
Yeah, let's finish the slides, and I'm happy to stay on, and
then we'll stay on for an extra 10 minutes or so and try to get through the questions.
Get through the questions.
If we can't get to all of them, we might respond to you to the group via email to the people who registered. So just keep putting your questions in the chat, and we'll try to answer as many as we can at the end.
Okay, so there's not that many more slides, but I wanted to touch upon a few other things. The first thing is this idea that there are some other systems that are also impacted in sensory processing, because it's very, very complex. So the first one is the emotional system and the sensory system. What wires together fires together, and this is in there kind of intuitively with the walking down a dark alley late at night. The emotional system and the sensory system, they're bosom buddies. Emotion will spiral sensory, and sensory will spiral emotion. And this is back from when we were both predators and prey. If we sense danger, we had to have the sensory kind of ability to respond to that better. So we could hear better, we could see better, we could smell better. So the hard thing is, if we're anxious, our sensory systems go up. If we can unwind, if we can kind of spiral ourselves downward in terms of our sensory system, and then also our sensory system, if we are hypersensitive, that will also drive our anxiety upwards. The good news is if we can bring the system down, it will also bring our emotional system down. So, it spirals up together, it spirals down together. And this is all deep in the very deep parts, the subcortical parts of the brain, that these systems wire together. This is also true, and I'm not going to get too much into the reflex system because this is, again, a whole conversation in and of itself, but I think it's important to be aware that our reflex system, and I don't mean like, you tap your knee and your knee activates. I don't mean the spinal reflexes, but there's a whole reflex system that creates kind of automatic movements and responses that also impact both the emotional and the motor systems. And just a couple of very quick examples. And so it's important when you're looking towards therapy to find somebody who kind of understands this and can work with this. And just a couple of very quick examples of this. Trunk extension is a reflex that I'll show you a little bit more of my body here. It's a reflex that brings us into extension like that. And if you try this for yourself and you try to kind of bring yourself into that strong extension, it puts you up on your toes. And if you try to walk like that, it has you kind of toe walking. So if we don't deal with trunk extension, then we're not going to have, motor impacts. And similarly, somebody asked a question about the startle. I saw earlier, I don't remember the exact question, but fear paralysis reflex and moro reflex, those are emotional reflexes. Fear paralysis, when it's working well, it is what guides us to just pause and look if somebody calls our name. And if we have a hyperactive fear paralysis, instead of pausing, we go into a freeze response. And that's also deep-seated in our brain. And so it becomes important to look at these things, not just at a sensory level, not just at an auditory level, not just at an emotional level, but also the reflexive component to fully address it. So similarly with regulation and executive function. So the ability to modulate sensory input, it develops earlier in life than the ability to regulate ourselves. An older infant, for example, might be able to manage sensory input, but doesn't have the ability to actually regulate himself. So when you think about that, self-regulation is actually a more complex skill than sensory regulation, but it's dependent on sensory regulation. So to stay calm and organized, we have to be able to manage our sensory environments. Now, self-regulation is a key component of executive function. If we can't stay calm, we can't stay organized, then we certainly can't think, we can't plan, we can't problem solve, we can't do all of those kind of components of executive function. I'm, again, not going to go deeply into executive function because it's its own topic. I just want to bring home the point that when we're addressing one of these skills, we really have to, we have to address the others as well, because there's strong interactions between them, and the skills really build upon one another. A child who, for example, in school is feeling that they can't kind of manage the cognitive components of the work is going to get more anxious about not being able to perform. And then that child is going to, with the anxiety ramping up, is going to get more hyperreactive and have more sensory problems as well. So just looking at this in a more complex and integrated way becomes important. A couple of other just really key components here. Medical trauma is a really important thing to look at with any child that's post-surgery. This is from a very recent meta-analysis that was done. 16% of, and this is not specific to epilepsy surgery, this is just general surgery in pediatric populations. 16% of children and 23% of parents show evidence of medical trauma post-surgery. And the more complex procedure, the longer the hospital stays, the greater the risk of this. The more social support the family has, the more the risk decreases. One thing that is key, if a child is going to go into any surgery, I'm assuming most people here are post-surgery, but if there's a surgery that's coming up, one of the key things is, if possible, allow the child some control when initiating the anesthesia. So for example, just allowing the child to put the mask on, or allowing the child to have the parents put the mask on rather than having an unknown person, a doctor, a nurse, an anesthesiologist put that mask on. Because what that does is, the research shows, and this is just broadly, that trauma, post-traumatic stress becomes most prevalent when people feel stuck or unable to act in a traumatic situation. So if it's a safe person, if it's a known person, or if the child can in fact do that themselves, then that mitigates that risk, because that person is not stuck with somebody else doing too. Some of the things, if there is medical trauma, these are the things that are evidence of it. A child re-experiencing, thinking excessively about the event would be the surgery in the situation, hyperarousal, avoidance of activity or interactions, excessive fear, cognitive changes, emotional regulation problems, and having excessive fears or worries, possibly panic attacks. It becomes important, I think, for everybody who has been through any kind of a significant medical event, and this is important for parents as well as for kids, just to look for a therapist that has a trauma-informed approach to care. And lastly, we're just making it, just having an integrative treatment model when you're looking for a therapist, somebody who's looking at things not just as sensory integration, but somebody who kind of can think about this more, all these different areas more broadly. So let's move on to questions. Again, I'm happy to stay a little bit longer so that we can work our way through questions.
Great. So I want to start, there's so many great questions. One really important thing, and I just put some things in the chat, so hopefully you all are looking at the chat, is about assessment. So a lot of you are asking, what do I do? What do I tell the school team, etc. Those of you who know me well know that I want a t-shirt when I do any presentations on any of this that says what mom wants doesn't matter, because you can know your child, you can know there's an issue, but until you have an expert evaluate your child and say this is a problem, they will not listen to you, right? And not Lindy's nodding her head.
It is one of the most frustrating things.
Yeah, yeah. So moms do know their kids best, and dads, and sometimes grandparents, right? Whoever's with the child, you know your child, but you cannot go in and say, I know my child needs to hang face down on the swing 5 minutes a day because this is how she's going to self-regulate. They're going to look at you like you have 3 heads, right? So what you need to do, what I did with Lindy was I learned, I met her, I found out she was an OT. Everybody at the school where we were was like, Lindy's amazing. She's the best OT in San Francisco. I'm like, well, that's who I want. So I went in and took Bennett in for his first evaluation, and I was completely blown away by what I learned. I paid for the evaluation privately. Not everybody has that option. So if you want to reach out to me directly about how to get support with that, I have strategies. But then I took that evaluation to the school and I said, these are the recommendations. I want you to implement them. And I was really insisted on them. And the school had no recommendations, nor had they ever looked at his sensory system. So just like I also mentioned in the chat about audiology assessment, not every audiologist understands CAP-D. I've talked to audiologists who said, what happens when the temporal lobe is removed? And they're like, I have no idea. So that's a concern. So if you go to an occupational therapist and they're like, oh, I know sensory, we can do dry brushing and jump on a trampoline, but they can't explain any of what Lindy just described. It means they read a pamphlet somewhere and they're trying to add it, but they don't really understand it. So trying to find someone, I think, and you comment on this, Lindy, that who really understands these things. It can be hard to find. Our kids are very complicated. But again, I'm a resource to help you try to find someone in your area. We've had some really great speakers at our conferences that are all over the US. I can certainly try to help you find someone. Then you either go get that evaluation yourself, or you ask the school to provide it. They are required to evaluate your child in all areas of suspected disability. And now that we've had this talk, you know this is an area of suspected disability for your child. And if they refuse, you ask for an independent educational evaluation, which is a separate webinar. But I just want to make that really clear. If you have not ever heard any of these words before, but you were nodding along and saying, this is my kid, the next step is for you to go and get that thorough evaluation somehow, some way, right? So I don't know if you have any comments on assessment, because that was a question that came up in the questions that came up in advance.
One thing that I want to add is that at least in San Francisco here, this is getting better. But one of the things that happens a lot in the districts is that OTs assess fine motor. It is handwriting for the younger kids. It is cutting, and they don't do sensory. And so being able to advocate to say, if my child can't, if we go back to the idea of this slide right here, executive function, they understand cognition, they understand executive function, but if you can, it's a very complicated concept, but if you can kind of understand that if we can't sit here and take in the sensory information, again, from our own perspectives, if I am overwhelmed by everything that's coming in from my environment, I can't think. Mm-hmm. And if I can't think, then I can't learn to write. Mm-hmm. So really kind of at a basic core level, if I can't think, I can't cook. If I can't, every time I go to cook dinner, I have to clean the counter before I have to clean the sink. I cannot start cooking dinner before I clean my dishes. I just can't. That because it is too much visual clutter for me. And if you can kind of, for yourself, think about how you are affected by your environment, whether it be visual, whether it be auditory, and how that affects your ability to think. And then you can take that to your school district if they're saying, well, we do fine motor, we don't do sensory, because that is a very common comment. That is a way to kind of push that assessment or that approach.
Yeah. And remember, we don't do that here is not a response that a district can use, because the law says very clearly that the child must be evaluated in all areas of suspected disability. And sensory processing disorder is a recognized disability, maybe not under IDEA, it would fall under OHI, other health impaired, if you only had sensory processing disorder. But you could get an IEP with just sensory processing disorder if the impact was significant enough. So they can't just say, we don't do that here, right? We can talk more about the assessment piece in another webinar. I want to make sure we get some of these questions. A parent asked, and the questions that came in advance about being sensitive to loud noises and sudden attention grabbing sounds, and he struggles with self-regulation. So one point I want to make, we talked a little bit about the auditory piece. I think of after hemispherectomy, temporal lobectomy, even occipital lobectomy to some degree, TPO for sure, corpus callosotomy. You have to be really aware of all of the sensory impacts to your child. It's not just like their peripheral hearing is fine, but the ability of the brain to process that information is damaged. So I describe it when I do my training for school teams. Imagine you're trying to learn math at a heavy metal concert. That's what it is like. It's not just that they are not hearing or they're hypersensitive, which can be part of the profile. It's that they cannot separate sounds out. Like you and I can tune each other in. I can listen to Lindy at a loud restaurant and I can tune into her auditory frequency and I can tune out all the other noise. And Lindy remembers going to a restaurant with Bennett and my family on Valencia Street. He had to go stand outside after he ordered and wait to come back in because he could not filter out that sound. So that's huge. Then there's the visual piece. We know hemianopia, which is the field cut. That's just one of the visual issues you can have. You can also have ocular motor dysfunction where the eyes don't work well together. And then you can have visual processing disorder, which is a whole nother webinar. And then thirdly, now we're at the sensory piece, which I think what Lindy's talking about combines those two. And then also kind of that central regulation of sense, it's touch, it's sight, it's sound, it's everything. And then also just like that proprioceptive thing, which I think is a really hard concept to get, is how do you fit in space around other people? You know, and then if you have a paretic arm and a kid is touching your paretic arm and you're hypersensitive, you're going to turn around and hit the kid behind you that touched your arm, right? So if the school and you don't fully understand this, they're not going to be able to address it. So super important.
Can I just add something
Absolutely,
to
yes.
that? I think that we forget just how hard these kids are working. I think, you know, these kids are working so incredibly hard and these environments are so complicated and there's such a desire to have kids integrated and these sensory environments for these kids are so complicated. And can I just talk about Bennett in fourth grade for a moment?
Absolutely, please. I know I'm not private at all.
Okay. And you know, Bennett was in a regular public school in fourth grade, and I remember going to observe him, and just my heart breaking because he was, you know, here's this really bright, sweet, wonderful kid, and he just looked so sad, and he was just working too hard. And I spoke with Audrey and her husband about it, and he just couldn't, as we go up in the grades, it just gets too hard. And it was just too hard for him.
He was clinically depressed at that time because of his situation.
So I think just being sensitive to just how hard these kids are trying. And at a certain point, not always, but at a certain point for many of them, it just does become too much. And putting them into a simpler environment so they can really learn because they want to learn. Want to learn is really important.
One other part on the assessment question was what assessments are done to continue understanding the child's needs as they grow older. And I would say repeat assessment with a qualified assessor, but I don't know if you have anything to add.
One of the things that I think if a kid can do it is doing self-assessment, or particularly as you get older, you know, sensory, I'm not a big fan of the sensory profile. Honestly, I really like the sensory processing questionnaire, and it has self-assessment. And I think it's very interesting to do both the caregiver part and the self-assessment part, because you can see, you can see, first of all, what a child's self-awareness is, which I think is really important. Sometimes kids don't, they can really report their own experience, but sometimes they also don't have good self-awareness, you know, as part of that metacognition. And so I think just like it's really important to get a school and a caregiver so that you can get that different perspective and be able to weigh the two and understand the full complex picture. I think especially as kids are getting older, it's really important to have that self-assessment. I also, you know, I really like getting as an OT, not just the sensory processing questionnaire, but also a functional questionnaire that really looks at not just what the sensory systems are like, but how does the kid kind of use this in function. I do my own kind of questionnaire for that. There's not one that I use that is a standardized one. I like doing a brief, which is an executive function one, because it also gives a lot of functional information about kind of the self-regulatory piece, as well as there's in executive function, there's kind of the more kind of regulatory hot executive function pieces, the more behavioral, if you will, and then the more kind of how do we process and organize information, which are the more cold executive function pieces. So I like all of those different components as I'm putting all the information together.
That's great. I shared our assessment spreadsheet in the chat, but I will make sure that I update that tab on sensory assessments with what you just recommended. I'll make sure that's in there. Another question was, my son needs significant proprioceptive input several times throughout the day. His physical disabilities limit his ability to do these activities independently, requiring a lot of time and support from caregivers. Ideas on how to proactively manage this.
Have you ever tried, I would say, have you ever tried either like a SPIO or Theratogs kind of the support where, because I found I don't tend to use Theratogs because my kids don't tend to need that level of support, but I've used SPIO really effectively for kids who need a little bit more support.
It's a sensory garment that provides like a hug, like a sensory hug throughout the day.
SPIOs are neoprene and they're fitted to the kids. Theratogs are a little bit more intense, kind of a higher level of support. But something like that, kids, I have seen the kids that benefit from them. It's not just, again, if we look at this from, like the sensory-based motor disorders, not just from it's providing good postural support, which it's much more about they're getting the input they need to be able to react and organize and kind of think, and it's that kind of thing. It's not that we're giving them a brace. It's that their bodies are feeling better because they feel their bodies better. And so therefore, if you're coming from that tripod perspective, we have that body and space more organized, and therefore we can take in that environmental information better. Otherwise, their bodies are kind of like, it's like that wobbly, you can't get a good picture if you have a wobbly tripod, and they have wobbly tripods. So that's kind of.
I would also say another suggestion for this parent would be, why are his proprioceptive inputs requiring someone else? So things like running, a trampoline. Bennett had a ball that he would hold in his hand and dig his chin into because he had this very deep pressure sensory proprioceptive need. If there's a sensory room that can be arranged where he can do falling, because like crash pad was something that my son, and he was able to do all these things pretty independently. So I would say work with your sensory OT, if you have one, to find more appropriate tools that he can do on his own to self-regulate. And then maybe if he doesn't have the awareness that he needs it, set timers or alarms or something, so that it's like a beep goes off. Oh, now it's time for me to jump on the trampoline for 1 minute and then go back to my desk, right? These are things that I've seen used in schools where they focus on kids with sensory processing disorders, where they're creating a sensory diet throughout the day with reminders, right? So it's not just, well, it's there, they can use it when they want. You don't want to wait till they're dysregulated, right? You want to be proactive.
Just to add to that real quickly. I was assuming that those were tools that the child, wasn't necessarily able to use, but there's also things like, assuming that this is all part of what the child is able to use, there's also things like if the child is seated in a chair, there's bands that you can put at the bottom of a chair that the child can kind of kick against during classes. There's different kinds of seating if the child has enough balance. There's kind of like mushroom stools that the child can kind of sit on. So there's a lot of different tools out there. Again, it's hard to say without knowing the individual capabilities and needs of the child. There's a lot of different tools, and I think it's important to get somebody on your team who understands these, who can make individualized suggestions for the child.
And this kind of relates to another question, which was about once the child has reached a state of hyperness, physically, tactile, sensory seeking, how do I help him come back down, especially when I've lowered the environmental stimuli. If I can't intervene before the child is sensory, hyperactive, et cetera, how do I help bring the child down?
Therapeutic use of self is, our buzzword in the field. So rhythms, we can use our own rhythms to organize our kids. I would say is the best if the child is so dysregulated. So rhythms organize according to each other, but they have to be close enough in sync. If they're too far off, then they don't really work. So you can think of that as like, when people are walking next to each other on a sidewalk, oftentimes our steps will fall in line with one another. Or if you're reading together in a group, you just kind of fall into line with one another. But again, you have to be close enough. So if you interact with your child, go into a quiet space, lower your voice, talk very, and this is actually, it sounds very easy, but it's actually not easy because we are kind of wired to activate with our children because we love them so much. And so when they're stressed, we get stressed. So do the opposite, talk quietly, slow down. You can slow down your breathing so that it's just a little bit, if you go too far down, your child probably won't respond, so that it's just a little bit slower, and then work it down from there. The other thing that I love to use when a child is really dysregulated is bubbles. Bubbles move very slowly and they capture visual attention. So I don't know, your child might be too old or not interested, but I find them to be incredibly effective. And I am a very good bubble blower. And so not blowing fast bubbles, but blowing slow bubbles and big bubbles. So if you can kind of practice your bubbles and, blow slow, big bubbles, it tends to really, because of the breath involved and because of the way they move, it tends to just kind of, without saying anything, slow things down. And the last thing is limit language. Nobody can process, even the most verbal person in the world doesn't process language well when we're stressed. Mm-hmm. And so few words, don't try to talk, just slow it down and minimize the language.
I would say too, just there should be some strategies that are worked on when he is regulated. Like for my son, it was things like learning how to take calming breaths, naming 5 colors in the room or 5 objects in the room. Like there were some things he worked on in cognitive behavioral therapy with his therapist that were basically self-regulation strategies that he would practice so that when he was in the moment and we are not introducing something new. It's like, well, you've done this many, many times and we practice it every single day on a routine. So then when he was dysregulated, I would say, can you give me 5 breaths? He would say, no. And I'd say, well, can you give me 1? And then I would just wait. And eventually I'd get a, and then, but he was starting, and then we could start to like take it down. Okay. There's a question that I'm going to answer and then let you answer. So hitting, anxiety, and boundary issues. The student just started high school. So a couple years ago, I did a training for a school team for a hige school kid who'd had a hemispherectomy. It was the first month of school, and they said, this kid has so many behavior problems, and we really want to understand what's behavior and what's medical. This was like their big question. It turns out this child had never had a CAPD evaluation and was in a room of 40 students, had no sensory tools or sensory knowledge at all. There were no strategies in place for him. There was no knowledge of any sensory possible issues. And he'd never been assessed for any visual challenges. And he was now seated in the back of the room, very far from the board. There were a number of factors. So I educated the team on, looking into these areas. I'm not going to tell them what to do, but I'm going to recommend these are some assessments you might do. And about 3 months, and what he was doing, his behavior that was so horrible was he'd go into the room in the morning, and about 15 minutes into class, he would excuse himself and go to the nurse. So then there's all this medical concern, right? Is he having seizures again? Everybody's freaking out, and the school's like, he can't keep doing this because everything becomes, So about 3 months later, I got a call from the teacher, and she said, we implemented an FM system and noise canceling headphones. He's got some sensory strategies that he uses before he enters the room and when he leaves the room. And then also visually, they moved him in the room and they had some strategies for the visual processing, and he was doing fine. So I'm not saying that is the answer. But if you are not looking at all three of the sensory components that can be impacting behavior, then you should be. If you have done all that and that's all in place and you're still having problems, I would recommend a functional behavior assessment, but be very careful that you're doing that in conjunction with an OT who's well-versed in sensory issues and really understands that, someone who really understands the vision impairments, and maybe the neurologist if the child is still on medication or having seizures. You don't want a behavior plan that is punishing a child for having a seizure, for example. Lindy, do you have anything to add on that?
No, not really. I think, I think if a kid is just saying very clearly, if a kid is having, aggression, reactivity at that level, just start with the environment, because bringing home the point again, or the other side, going back to this slide here. If a kid is here or here, Bennett was here, he was depressed, withdrawn. This kid was here. So anytime you see a kid in those kind of extreme places in school, start with, what is it in the environment? These kids are working really, really, really hard, and how do we adapt that? And don't start with, this kid is a problem child.
Yeah.
Because
my answer to the team when she said, I need to know what's behavior and what's medical, I said, this child had half of his brain removed. It's all medical, right? If you want to use that term medical, it's all medical, right? Okay. A question about chewing. So the first question this parent asked was about talking at her son speaks in a very loud voice. He has a difficult time modulating his voice, but he talks so loud he makes himself cough, but this doesn't happen at school. And then the same child also bites his nails and gnaws on his skin until it bleeds, and fidgets and chewies don't work. And he's a young adult. He's 18 or 19 years old. So just for context, because I know sometimes the younger children, we see this more and they will age out of it, but I think at this age it is a bigger concern.
Right.
What do you think about that?
I think this is a really tricky one. I apologize for the movement behind. I have to come out of my house because there's some things that need to happen at my house. So I'm just gonna move out.
You get to see the San Francisco sunshine.
Yes, yes. It is nice here. It's a beautiful day.
Yeah.
I think this is really tricky. I think that the kind of oral seeking we organize with our mouths, and this is a really common thing to organize with our mouths. And I think that he is doing this. Some of this is probably habitual. I don't find chewies in general. I don't use them that often. Occasionally I'll use them, but I honestly don't use them that often. So I'm not terribly surprised that it's not that effective. And I don't unfortunately have a great answer for this one. Some of this, it is habitual, and it's as a long-term nail biter when I was a kid, who stopped in my 30s, it can be really tricky. I also think, quite honestly, that that sometimes what happens with the sensory systems is that, just as by way of explanation, that we actually use our sensory systems to alert ourselves, and to keep ourselves, that alerting is a way of keeping ourselves safe. And so this is a little bit counterintuitive, but for example, that feeling of hurting his skin, making himself bleed, might be a way actually of alerting his system. And I'll use the example of, like, I don't bite my nails anymore or do anything, but I do this kind of stuff a lot. So it's like I'm feeling the edges of my nails a lot. And that is a way of in the sensory system, kind of waking up my sensory system. And so there might be an element where it's not just about chewing, but it might be about feeling his skin, that kind of, where are my edges? Where is the sensation in my body? So he's trying to feel himself more. And so chewies are not going to help with that. So how do we help him get sensation to his system? I have another child who does this on the autism spectrum a lot. And something that I've used effectively for her, they have these little, I don't know if you've seen them, they're like little round rings that are a little bit pokey, spiral rings. I'm blanking on what the name of them. You can kind of roll them up and down the fingers, and they give you that kind of pokey edges. Have you ever seen those, Audrey?
I've seen them. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm blanking on the name of them right
I
now.
can help this parent
Yeah, so you can
find
try,
that. Yeah.
you can try something like that, but I suspect that he's actually going for some of that sharpness of sensation,
Mhm.
due to maybe some diminished sensation or some low sensation in his body. And that's part of it's actually a feature, if you will, of this, not a um not a not a problem for him, even though it's a problem for
Yeah.
others.
I
And
know
that's
that
what we need to look to try to diminish it.
yeah, my husband has to have a fidget all the time, and and Bennett shakes his leg all the time. It's a stim for him, right? So
Yeah.
you're finding ways, like you said, to keep that arousal, to keep in that just right state if they're, hypo, right, rather than hyper.
Mhm.
And so that might be the reason why. There's another parent that said she has a 7-year-old, and she said she chews on her lips. And she also touches her lips a lot, causing her to get colds more easily. And they give her chew necklaces off, but she takes them off.
Yeah,
And then
it's not the
also
same.
touching private areas at inappropriate times. Since her hemispherectomy, how do we help with this?
Yeah, very similar kind of situation. Similar situation, similar response. What she's looking for is she's looking for input. I mean,
Mhm.
again, looking to ourselves, like I have a little fidget ring that has sharp edges, and I'll do this a lot with it.
Mhm.
Um, be, so how do we, I don't know if she can chew gum. Gum is a really good one, because on the one hand, it's functional,
Mhm.
doesn't look strange. Some kids are very sensitive to that looking strange. It's also, chews are just a very it's kind of a munching movement. Chewing gum actually is an organized movement of the tongue. It's a rotational movement, and your tongue has to kind of do work to move it around. If you just do that munching motion, it's actually going to get longer and longer, and then you're going to swallow it. So it forces a more organized movement of the mouth. So you can look to something like gum and see if that works. Some kids are not able to chew gum. It's just too complex of a motion. Um, but um, but these are tricky things. You can look, I would say the same thing for her. Look to one of those spiral kind of sensory rings and see if something like that can help her, because I think she's probably also looking for that kind of
Mhm.
alerting strategy. When it comes to, kids who masturbate as a part of their STEM, I think that just has to be, it's just teaching them with lots and lots and lots of repetition that, there are places that they can do that, and there are places that they can't. And it just takes a while and a lot of repetition on that one. It's just tricky.
All right, it is 10:30. Thank you so much. I know we did not get to every single question, but those of you who had outstanding questions, there are things I can help you with offline. So just email me if I don't get back to you with a question. But I'm incredibly grateful for your time today, Lindy. I think everybody learned a lot. I'm glad we went over, because this is such a big topic. I'd love to invite you back to talk about executive function maybe next year. So we'll have to talk about that offline. But thank you, big applause. It was really wonderful. I'm gonna be happy to see you again, I hope.
Yes. Yes.
You
Thank you for having me here.
really, really thrilled to have you.